Michael Saylor is now talking about something important, something that probably 95% of people in Bitcoin will never do. But before we get into that, some people believe you need 10 Bitcoin to retire. And I always ask, do you really think you need 10 Bitcoin? I don't think so. And that's why we're talking about the fact that we actually need much less. And to understand that, we need to look a bit at the distribution of Bitcoin. Many Bitcoin addresses hold only tiny amounts of Bitcoin. There are about 50 million addresses with up to 1 million Satoshis, which is up to 0.01 Bitcoin. And current data from sources like Bitinfo charts show about 43 million addresses with less than 0.01 Bitcoin. And a Reddit post mentions 54 million Bitcoin addresses. These are small holders, called shrimps or no-coiners. Then there are tens of millions of crabs, meaning holders with 1 to 10 Bitcoin. Next, we have around 830,000 octopuses, which are those with 10 to 50 Bitcoin. And then there are the fish with 50 to 100 Bitcoin. There are only a few 100,000 of those, and among the whales, there are just a few thousand. The idea is that most people have only a little. So Bitcoin is distributed, but now we see how Bitcoin is quickly disappearing from the exchanges. There are supposed to be 2 to 2.5 million Bitcoin on the exchanges, and this amount is shrinking very quickly. In July 2025, it was said to be about 2.4 million Bitcoin. Presumably, it's significantly less now, and that was already a multi-year low. And according to CryptoQuant data, 421,000 Bitcoin left the exchanges from February to November 2024, and since January 2025, around 121,000 Bitcoin have left as well. So the trend is clear. Fewer Bitcoin on the exchanges means higher prices because the supply is decreasing. And the fact is, you don't need 10 Bitcoin to retire. With less supply, the price per Bitcoin could rise to $7 million, of course. That's speculative, but it absolutely makes sense if the market capitalization grows. And we're talking about today's purchasing power, about the money that's currently circulating in the world. Now, just imagine, and I'll explain a concept to you now, how you can plan with Bitcoin. When you can retire with Bitcoin, simply through calculations and facts that we'll go through together. I find the whole thing very, very exciting because it shows how much Bitcoin you need to finance your desired lifestyle. When the point comes where you can stop working and when you can retire with Bitcoin, we'll do this step by step with assumptions that you can adjust yourself or verify for yourself. So let's assume you have Bitcoin, and we can see right now how Bitcoin is growing while regular money is losing value. For our calculation, we'll simply assume a Bitcoin price of around $120,000 per Bitcoin. Because the Bitcoin price is currently rising very quickly and we need a constant for our calculation. So let's go through or look at 4 more scenarios. And first, you ask yourself, how much Bitcoin do you have? What is your desired annual income? For example, in today's dollars, let's say $100,000. Then how fast is the money supply growing? In other words, what is the inflation rate? And I'm assuming 12% per year. And that's conservative when we look at the cost of living, how much it has increased, and how much the Bitcoin price is rising. Many people think of 20 or 30% per year, but if we look at history, Bitcoin's compound annual growth rate, or CAGR, is much higher. From early 2009 to 2025, over 16 years, it is about 190%. And that's, even in 2020, the 10-year CAGR was around 200%, and the 8-year was about 80%. So clearly above the 20 to 30%, and currently, for the last 10 years, up to July 2025, it was about 82%. Based on prices of around $300 in 2015 to $120,000 now, and that's during a period with ups and downs. That's why I think it's too pessimistic to set the bar low for Bitcoin. Basically, you should think bigger and be more optimistic about where Bitcoin is headed. So let's assume a growth rate of 50% per year for Bitcoin, and that's bullish, but also realistic based on history, combined with 12% fiat devaluation, that effectively results in about 62% growth in purchasing power per year. And now let's look at all of this with just a single Bitcoin. So one whole Bitcoin, which today would be $120,000. When could you retire with that? At $100,000 desired annual income, the idea here is that one Bitcoin will become so valuable that you can live off the growth without having to touch the principal, taking into account appreciation and devaluation at 50% appreciation and 12% inflation. You reach about 2029. That's when you reach the point where your Bitcoin is worth around $870,000, adjusted to current figures and so on. Your personal retirement date would then be around the 20th of April 2029. At that point, your Bitcoin has enough purchasing power to cover your expenses because it keeps growing while the currency gets weaker. And basically, the calculation works like this. The value increases annually by this effective factor, and it again shows a savings. Bitcoin growth and fiat weakening, which will definitely happen because money is being printed without limit. That's why this is so cool. It fits everyone depending on your Bitcoin share and shows exactly when you'll be free. Let's run through the whole thing now with 0.1 Bitcoin. That's 10% of a whole Bitcoin, currently about $12,000. This number is even more bullish, and I'll explain why it shows that. Basically, it means that even smaller amounts of Bitcoin can make you rich quickly if the growth continues. Essentially, if we see this development, we could retire in 2029 with just a single Bitcoin. That's definitely a fact. That would be enough to retire with Bitcoin. And now just imagine, your Bitcoin grows so much that starting in 2029, you could withdraw 59,000 Satoshis daily, which would then be worth about $449. Enough for a good life, but don't sell the whole thing. Instead, use it smartly, use one Bitcoin as collateral. And that's something Michael Saylor, the CEO of MicroStrategy, has often recommended as well. Saylor is known for his Bitcoin maximalist stance and often advises never to sell your Bitcoin, but instead to borrow against it to gain liquidity without having to give up the asset or pay taxes on gains. And this is part of his strategy to view Bitcoin as a long-term store of value. Michael Saylor also says that he will never sell his Bitcoin. Let's talk about your existing holdings. As I mentioned in the intro, you have paper gains of about 70% or so, which is the kind of return a lot of people would love to see. At any point would you sell? When would it make sense to take profits there?
Well, I famously said I'm going to be buying the top forever. Bitcoin is the exit strategy. It is the strongest asset. So what we're seeing right now is that Bitcoin is being elevated to $1 trillion asset class. And it's alongside names like Apple, Gold, and MicroStrategy. But the difference between Bitcoin and the Magnificent Seven is that Bitcoin is an asset class. It's not a company. There isn't enough room in the capital structure of these companies to hold 10 or $100 trillion of capital. So Bitcoin is up against gold, which is now 10x, and against the S&P index. It's up against, in reality, a $100 trillion asset class as a store of value. So we believe that capital will flow from these asset classes into Bitcoin because Bitcoin is technically superior to these asset classes, and that's the case. There's simply no reason
to sell the winner in order to buy the loser. And you could retire with Bitcoin by 2029. What happens if we now assume that Bitcoin increases by 80% per year? Suddenly, you could retire as early as 2026. And there's a reason why Albert Einstein called compound interest the eighth wonder of the world. It's very hard to grasp exponential growth. And for example, if we only had 0.1 Bitcoin, which today would be an investment of $12,000, and Bitcoin were to increase by 50% per year, and we want to retire with $100,000 per year, then we could, with 0.1 Bitcoin, retire with Bitcoin in 2036. That's just 11 years, assuming. Of course, Bitcoin continues to grow by 50% or more, which is probably also the case. Remember, that's 11 years, and I think you can, in most places in the world, with $100,000, retire per year, and that's a very conservative outlook on retiring with Bitcoin, because we're only assuming that Bitcoin increases by 50% per year. I think that's a very conservative calculation, and we'll probably see a bit higher growth. Massachusetts YBE 70%, 80%, 90%. So 0.1 Bitcoin isn't so bad to have, because with it you can retire relatively quickly. And let's take a look at a slightly more bullish scenario. Let's assume Bitcoin rises by 80% per year. Suddenly, you could already retire with 0.1 in 2031. Bitcoin, much earlier and faster than many can imagine, or than you might have thought. That's why you need to get into the market now. They always say, show in the market, beat the market. It's all about market timing, and the longer you stay out, the more profits you miss. And with Bitcoin, there's this saying, the 12 best days of the year far outperform the rest of the year. And many people don't even know that. These days are incredibly strong, and we might actually be seeing them right now. That's why I advise you, of course, this is not financial advice to be in the market and to do it today. Don't listen to the fear-mongering, for example, that bureaucrats and politicians in the West will restrict us. Especially in Europe, the plans of the European Central Bank are becoming increasingly concerning, and Bitcoin will probably be the only alternative or the only exit strategy in this situation. To protect and save yourself from these plans of the European Central Bank regarding the digital euro, and if you want to buy Bitcoin securely, you'll find a platform in the description below the video. I use it myself and I'm very satisfied with it. And if you want to store your Bitcoin offline and keep your cryptocurrencies offline, which I can definitely recommend, you'll also find the link for that in the description below the video. Trading is extremely important. There you'll basically find what I use. In summary, all of this shows how powerful Bitcoin can be as a path to financial freedom, even with small amounts. And Michael Saylor, the CEO of MicroStrategy, strongly advises never to sell your Bitcoin. Remember, instead, it's highly recommended to borrow against it in order to gain liquidity, without having to pay taxes on gains or give up the core of your Bitcoin. And that's a strategy that probably 95% of people will ignore, but it could be the key to benefiting in the long term. And at the end of the day, it's about taking action now and seeing Bitcoin as your path to independence. Basically, just get started. Start small, stay consistent, and let growth work for you. I wish you a wonderful day.